Welcome to the American Committee for U.S.-Russia Accord. I'm James Carden. Our guest today is the essayist and translator, Paul Grenier, whose essays have appeared in American Affairs, The National Interest, The American Conservative, the Baltimore Sun, and in translation in Russian, Spanish, and French. Paul worked for many years as a simultaneous interpreter for the U.S. Defense and State Departments, interpreting for General Tommy Franks, and serving as lead interpreter for U.S. Central Command's peacekeeping exercises with post-Soviet states. He is the founder and president of the Simone Weil Center for Political Philosophy. And full disclosure, I'm pleased to say that I serve on the center's board. And Paul is a friend, so right off the bat, I'm going to abandon any pretense at objectivity. He just authored a groundbreaking essay in the National Interest magazine titled Technology and Truth, Reflections on Russia, America, and Live Not by Lies. So Paul, I was talking this weekend to a very close friend, and I was prepping for this interview, and she asked, well, what is the essay really about? And I replied that in a nutshell, in my opinion, you show how over the years among the US governing elite, how power has steadily taken on more importance than truth itself. And this made me think about a concept you yourself introduced me to a few years ago called volunteerism. And the concept seems central to the thesis of your essay. So I'd like to begin there. How would you describe the thesis of your essay for those who haven't yet read the piece? And maybe start by touching upon the concepts of volunteerism and a technocracy.
Thank you, James, for that. That was a generous introduction, and it's great to get a chance to talk to you about this essay. I think it's something like 7,500 words, and so it's difficult. People have asked me before, if I could summarize it in a sentence to try to do so, and I was thinking, when I was writing it and editing it, and afterwards, I have to say the National Interest worked with me, and I thought they were great to work with. I think they were really careful at editing, and I feel like all the words in the essay are needed, and despite its length, so it's difficult to summarize, but nonetheless, it's possible nonetheless to summarize that it's about the transformation of the United States from being a civilization that still has a relationship with classical sense of truth, and then a break where it always had a contradictory relationship with truth, but at a certain point there came a break, and I define it in this essay as that break as coming on November 22nd, 1963. That might seem arbitrary, and in some sense it is an arbitrary division, but that basically at that point a fatal change took place in which sort of the sacredness of truth as something that's part of American civilization was sort of thrown aside. And so to me, technocracy is the regime or the culture that results when truth as something sacred is shunted aside. And the technological way of relating to reality is substituted in its place. And that is a tricky concept. And it's in the middle of the essay. There's a couple of pages where I mainly rely on prior thinkers, George Grant among them, and where basically truth is becomes something that's made, like an object, like a thing, and so that there is no givenness to reality. There's no givenness to the truth. It's not like a gift that comes from, or that has rooted somewhere in some eternal order, as in sort of classical thought. That's just completely shunted aside, and you're just left with dead matter, which our will can shape as it wills. And so this idea that the will is not bounded by anything other than the will itself, is what I mean by voluntarism.
Right, and that seem to indicate that the adoption of this way of thinking by the U.S. national security state has had wider cultural implications. So I'm going to quote from the essay now. You're right. In the actual historical development of voluntarist technologism, it was the U.S. national security state that honed this approach by making just such an instrumentalization of reason the most vital tool in its arsenal. And this seems to me that this has been a feature of the U.S. national security apparatus since at least the Gulf of Tonkin. And it seems to me that you go on to argue that the culture just today is now basically catching up to the national security establishment in the movements that we've seen over the past couple of years. Is that a correct reading of your piece?
Yes, I think it is. I like the way you just put it. I think that makes a lot of sense. It is that actually fits in with the logic of the essay. That what Dreher is describing with this sort of, it's not a left or right thing really. It's like a culture which takes the imagination of reality and which really is a kind of a technologization of reality. That's that does fit in with the logic of the national security state. They both kind of manufacture realities. Yeah.
Right. And so then there would be some implications then, or it would go a long way towards explaining the multiple failures of our foreign policy over the past several decades. So today we're sitting here during the fall of Kabul and the wrapping up, long overdue in my opinion, of the war in Afghanistan. In another part of your essay, you write that in the 1960s, quote, the spiritual and intellectual atmosphere of the US underwent a sea change. And one of the results of that sea change was the rise of technocrats who preferred the methods of untruth and control. And so what resulted was, and I'm quoting you again, the complete alienation of action from genuine understanding, which created the ideal framework for endless work. So it struck me that formulation gets to the heart of the problem which our foreign policy establishment faces today, particularly with Afghanistan. 20 years, we've seen this dynamic at play, the alienation of action from genuine understanding, and that produced endless work or endless war.
Yeah. That is a really central point from a political perspective, I think, and why this is so important. It gets into the whole sort of the effective aspect of capitalism as a philosophy, I think, and because there's this idea, I think, that there's this concern in our culture that the worst thing that could happen is that you don't have enough to do, that you lose your job. The profit rate slows down or reverses.
Right. What are you going to do? Right.
Well, and what can you do? I mean, like anything at all is permissible as long as you don't allow that one evil thing to happen, which is that people, that the profit rate should slow down or growth. But this is also, I learned a lot from Hanna Arendt, I think, in thinking about American politics and about this problem of sort of the technocratic order, even though I don't believe she uses that word. But I do make a lot of reference to her analysis of the Pentagon Papers and of Vietnam, and that it's not so much that they were not concerned about factuality. I mean, the technocrats who created the Vietnam War were smart, educated people, who went to elite schools. They could understand, a logical argument. They could understand factuality and so forth, what was factually true, what wasn't true. But but in their relationship to what was going on politically in Vietnam or to the American people, all of that the truth could be bracketed in the interests of the project. Let's keep this thing going. The main thing, and she keeps emphasizing this, is the appearances of what's happening. How does it look? And if you can maintain the appearances, then you can maintain the project. And which really is the logic of technology, is that the means replaces the end, because what you lose when you lose the sort of the classical worldview is that the thingness or the actual givenness of what's true and what's good as the first ordering principle. It's like you start with the mansion that you need to preserve. That's where you start with, and then action is oriented towards preserving that actual good thing. But if there's no good thing, then you just keep tearing down houses and rebuilding them, because all that matters is the means. That there's no settled ends anymore. That's technocracy.
Right. So you mentioned Arendt, and I'll go to the part of the essay towards the end of it where you touch upon some of her thinking. You write that Arendt was very concerned about a trend within American high politics that was abandoning its concern for reality, and therefore abandoning a commitment to the factual order that exists independently of our will. And as you point out, a question that she herself asked was this: if modern political lies are so big that they require a complete rearrangement of the whole factual texture, what prevents these new stories, images, and non-facts from becoming an adequate substitute for reality and factuality? So I'll ask you a question that you yourself pose in your piece. Are there sufficient grounds for a supposition that Arendt was thinking not only of the infamous regimes of the interwar years in the 1930s, but also of the United States that was already evolving at the time that she was writing in the late 60s, in the late 60s, yeah.
Yeah. That's one of my, I suppose, controversial theses in this paper that I tried to demonstrate, that I think that she absolutely was thinking of the United States as, if not already in some sort of imitation of a totalitarian order, was in danger of heading there. In her interview for French television in 1973, which was her last interview, it's clear that she took the fact that the Pentagon Papers was defended by the Supreme Court, and that Ellsberg wasn't imprisoned, as a sign that the constitutional order had survived a challenge, but just barely. And the fact that you could tell from the way she's speaking in that interview in such a guarded way, that she's already speaking elliptical language, and sort of, she's not saying, when she says, I don't know what you know or don't know about what happened with the Kennedy assassination. And that's a guarded way of saying something. And she talks about how, and I mentioned this in my piece, that she says, somehow I still feel safe speaking my mind openly with you during this interview, which is another way of saying, sort of in Ethiopian language, that I also feel there's also a sense of danger in saying what I think is true. So there's already her sense that it turns out in various ways that it's very possible to create a complete alternative reality. They did it successfully with the Vietnam War, and for a time until it collapsed. So, thank God for that from her perspective. But then she also mentions, that there was a crime, that the assassination of John F. Kennedy was a crime of the highest political order. But she also flags that it's taboo to talk about it. And by the very way she talks about it, she acknowledges that taboo. And I think that I think she's deeply concerned about that, and that because the crime being hidden, a crime of that order, suggests that it is, in fact, in one respect, it was possible to create a parallel political reality which has all of the trappings of reality without any of its substance.
And 4 decades after the assassination, senior administration officials during the George W. Bush administration were bragging about how they had the ability now to create their own reality. We live in the reality-based community we created because we're a global superpower. And I think that's what what we mean here by power transcending truth.
Yeah, that's a perfect absolutely.
So I want to get back. You mentioned earlier Dreher. So Dreher is Rod Dreher, and the title of your essay includes the title of his book. And your essay uses that book, Live Not by Lies, as a kind of jumping off point. And Dreher, for those of you who don't know, is a conservative-ish writer at the American Conservative. Now, as I've said to you before, in private over beers at our favorite bar in Washington.
Don't name it. Don't name it. We need to keep it private.
Though I might link to it in the notes. Dreher has always struck me as someone who writes too much and thinks too little. And if I'm reading your essay right, when it comes to Soviet history, he comes across as one of those movement National Review conservatives who has read maybe one book by Robert Conquest or Anne Applebaum, and then acts as though they know everything there is to know about the topic. You know the sort of person that I'm talking about. So let's just go to Dreher's book. What does he get? And I should tell viewers that you are an actual expert in the history of the Soviet Union and Russia. What does he get right, and what does he get wrong in his analysis?
I think that I don't fault Dreher for writing a lot. It's the fate of of sort of modern journalism, and you're expected to crank out and to be productive. I do agree with Simone Weil. I think she, on this topic, that she felt that public policy or scholarly journals should she was always excessive. I think like by law they should not be allowed to publish more often than once every 2 weeks. And because it's impossible to be thoughtful, and prolific at the same time. And so I feel I know that Dreher gets a lot of criticism. Sometimes it's justified, but I think that Dreher gets a lot of things right. And I didn't mean in this piece to badmouth him or to be dismissive of him. But he's not an expert in Soviet Union or in Russian history, clearly, and that is clear from reading the text. And the reason it's important, I think, in the context of Technology and Truth as a sort of a meditation, is that the truth is always the whole of the phenomenon. And the wholes of a phenomenon as complex as Russia or the Soviet Union is complex. You can't just boil it down to some sort of Cold War slogans, because that's also politically important, because if the Soviet Union in 1962 is just this evil, miserable place, where there's just absolutely no redeeming qualities to it at all, then when the Joint Chiefs of Staff come to Kennedy and say, let's do a first strike, and he says, are you guys even human? He mutters to himself as he leaves the room. That mentality of sort of taking a complex reality and saying it's nothing but this evil thing is politically consequential and is also false. And that this is where, so Dreher, as the piece sort of maybe goes on to great length to point out, he's very correct when he condemns what the Soviet Union did in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. I mean, some of the flower of the Russian nation and many hapless victims, were murdered. And, some of the best saintly people in the Christian church were simply murdered. Think of Pavel Florensky, one of the greatest minds of the 20th century in Russia, dies in the camps. He's absolutely right to point that out. The problem is that in the there was a tendency, and I think it's still true, to understand other countries the way they were 30 years ago, and not the way they are in the present moment. And so in the 60s and 70s, Americans are responding to what they finally realized about the way the Soviet Union had been decades earlier, and are not responding to the current reality. And so, I think I'm afraid I may be responding at too great a length, but it's something that I could talk about for hours, about all the complicated aspects of Russia in the 50s and the 60s and 70s, which were very humane, and where it wasn't this money-centered culture where people, many people could devote their lives to their friendships, to their love for poetry, to their love of Russian literature, to their piano playing, and they didn't have to feel insecure while doing that. There were many things that were terrible about the Soviet Union, and I'm not trying to be an apologist for all the bad things that really were bad in the Soviet Union, but my point is that he loses sight of that complexity.
Right, and he's not alone in doing that. As I know that you knew Stephen F. Cohen, and I knew him, and he wrote an excellent book called Rethinking the Soviet Experience in the mid-1980s, and he pointed out the problem with the so-called totalitarian school of Soviet studies, and it's a school that it seems that Dreher has been heavily influenced by. And I'm gonna quote what Steve wrote.
Yeah.
He wrote that that historical analysis came down to the thesis of an inevitable, unbroken continuity throughout Soviet history, thereby largely excluding the stuff of real history, conflicting traditions, alternatives, turning points, and multiple causalities. Political analysis fixated on a regime imposing its inner totalitarian logic on an impotent, victimized society, thereby largely excluding the stuff of real politics, which would pretty much sum up the Dreher thesis, no?
Yeah, although I think in fairness to Dreher, he's not claiming that he's writing a book that's really about the Soviet Union and Russia. That's not his aim.
Right, it's more of a...
He's really talking about the present moment in the West and in the United States, and it's just a jumping off point for him to worry out loud or to flag that this is the way totalitarianism works, and look at these parallels. And I think that those parallels often make sense in the context of his rhetorical aim, but for the perspective of my own aims in my essay, it exemplifies sort of a refusal of the philosophical attitudes in studying and in looking at an object of study. The fact is that the Soviet Union was always defined by multiple contradictory sort of cultural forces. It had a technocratic strain within it from the very beginning and all the way through to the end. That technology and science would solve all of our problems, and it was sort of very directed towards a future, this sort of abstract future where like everyone would be free from labor, and it had a very materialistic view of nature as something simply to be manipulated, in an absence of reverence, obviously an absence of any theistic concept. But at the same time, it was also a very traditional society that rooted in 19th century humanist thought. And even Marx he was able to praise like the writings of Elizabeth Gaskell, like North and South, which are, it's like praising Jane Austen. I mean, Hegel was a part of Russian thought, and Hegel thought all of past was absorbed into the present. So it wasn't, so, I mean, the Russian classical musical tradition lived in the Soviet Union. It actually thrived. But it wasn't this sort of rejection of the old. It was in many ways an incorporation of the old into the present of the Soviet Union. And Russia itself continued to survive. And this is one of the things that I think that the West, this is another one of my points, is that the Western technocratic order looked at that and decided, let's destroy that. Let's replace that with a presentism that simply constantly gets rid of the past.
And that project of presentism, you touch upon, and he actually touches upon in his book. So we'll go back to your essay.
Steve Cohen does?
No, I'm sorry, Dreher.
Oh, yeah.
So you write that the book offers the tried and true Cold War theme of an essentially good and free West against an essentially bad and unfree East. This makes it all the more jarring when one of Dreher's Hungarian interlocutors observes that 30 years of freedom had destroyed more cultural memory in Hungary than in any previous era. Quote, what neither Nazism nor communism could do, victorious liberal capitalism has done, a Hungarian teacher told him. And I think that might go a long way in explaining some of the political backlash that we've seen in Eastern Europe towards these kind of supranational projects, particularly against the EU, and in some cases against the so-called rules-based international order, which is, as anyone who would read and absorb your essay would realize, that it is neither rules-based nor international, right? So how do you see
the rule is a rather perverse rule. Great. Yeah.
All right. So I guess we're running out of time, unfortunately. So I've saved perhaps the toughest for last, but knowing you, I know you can handle it. And it's this, after I finished reading the essay, I think for the second time, I wondered, how do we come back from this, right? How do you suggest we break out of this cycle of untruth in the service of power, and return to a politics based on truth and reality?
You are absolutely right. That is the toughest question. And I mean, and if we're running out of time, I'll try to be brief. But I think I suggest at the end that Russia maybe has a role to play in coming out of this. Because I mean, I think with the idea of the classical idea of truth, which, to be honest, in my essay, I think it would be better to say the classical and the Christian understanding of truth within our civilization, while it still remained a civilization, depended on not simply throwing overboard classical thought in the Christian tradition. You can't preserve the tradition and throw it out at the same time, which is what we are doing. And the essay ends on an almost pessimistic note by suggesting that the whole world has become technocratic. The whole world has imitated the United States to that extent already decades ago. So I think that what we need somehow to figure out is I think that people are just naturally imitative, and we need somehow to create a different international imitative dynamic where when people who are willing to stand up for the truth in different civilizations, in different contexts, in different countries, sort of look up to one another and defend one another and are supportive and inspired. But that's a kind of a, makes it sound easy. And I think that the other part of it, to be honest, is that we need to be, there's no way around having to prepare to suffer, period. I mean, a technocracy which only respects voluntarist will and force is not gentle and it's not civilized. And to simply to be a witness to what's true and what's good and what's beautiful, to hold on to what's sacred in the past is not going to be easy. And Dreher, to that extent, is absolutely correct. And that's really his main point, is that be prepared to suffer. That's, and suffering is not the greatest, that is the kind of core of our tradition that starts with Socrates, right? I mean, is that it's that you can, the person who stands up for the truth is happy even if he's tortured, is basically Socrates mentioned. That's the core of his message. And I think we need to recall that.
Okay, well, Paul, thanks very, very much. Not only for coming on, but for taking the time and the effort to write such a profound meditation on our present state of affairs. I look forward to catching up soon, and really thanks for coming on. I appreciate it.
Thank you.